You were born without teeth, without the ability to walk, and without the strength to lift your own head. For the first year of your life, you were almost entirely helpless. And yet somehow, for roughly 300,000 years, human infants survived this exact vulnerability in a world with no hospitals, no formula, no cribs, and no safe place that wasn't also home to leopards. How did any of them make it? The answer reveals something remarkable about what it actually took to keep a human child alive before modern medicine existed, and it is far more sophisticated than most people assume. Start with the basic problem. Human babies are born more helpless than almost any other primate. Anthropologist Sarah Blaffer Hrdy, in her research on the evolution of human parenting, has pointed out that human infants are born with brains only about 25% of their adult size, compared to roughly 50% in chimpanzees. This is sometimes called the obstetric dilemma. Human brains are large, human pelvises are constrained by upright walking, and the compromise evolution settled on was to give birth early, before the brain finishes developing, and finish that development outside the womb instead. This means human infants arrive needing far more care, for far longer, than any other primate species. They cannot cling to their mother's fur. They cannot regulate their own body temperature efficiently. They cannot find food. For the first several years of life, a human child is completely dependent on adults simply to stay alive. So who provided that care? This is where the story gets interesting. The image many people carry of prehistoric parenting is a single mother, alone, carrying a baby through the wilderness. The actual anthropological evidence tells a very different story. Hrdy's research, along with decades of fieldwork among modern hunter-gatherer societies that offer a window into ancestral patterns, points to something called cooperative breeding. Human children were not raised by mothers alone. They were raised by a wide network: grandmothers, older siblings, aunts, and unrelated adults within the group, a pattern anthropologists call alloparenting. Anthropologist Polly Wiessner, who has spent decades studying the Juhonski people of the Kalahari, documented extensively how childcare was distributed across the entire camp. A crying infant might be picked up by whoever was nearest, regardless of biological relationship. Older children, sometimes as young as 6 or 7, regularly carried and entertained toddlers, freeing mothers to forage, process food, or rest. Grandmothers, no longer reproducing themselves, became some of the most valuable caregivers in the group, a pattern researchers now call the grandmother hypothesis, which helps explain why human women, unlike most mammals, live for decades after menopause. Without this network, your ancestors do not survive. Now picture a specific moment. An infant 6 months old, too young to walk, too young to forage, completely dependent on milk and warmth. The mother needs to gather food. She cannot carry the infant the entire day across rough terrain while also digging roots or tracking edible plants. So she does not have to. A grandmother takes the child, or an older cousin straps the infant against their body using a simple sling made of woven plant fiber or soft hide, devices that anthropologists believe existed tens of thousands of years before recorded history. Based on comparative evidence from surviving hunter-gatherer cultures and indirect archaeological clues like wear patterns on tools used to process hide and fiber, this baby carrier matters more than it might seem. Anthropologist Sheena Lou Levy, who studies childhood among foraging societies, has noted that constant physical contact between infants and caregivers, being carried, rather than left lying down, likely had real physiological benefits, including more stable body temperature regulation and reduced infant crying, which in environments with predators was not a small concern. Crying babies attract attention, and not the kind you want. This brings us to one of the harshest realities of ancient childhood, the mortality rate. Skeletal evidence from numerous archaeological sites, along with mortality data from contemporary and historical hunter-gatherer populations studied by demographers like Kim Hill and Magdalena Hurtado in their research among the Aché of Paraguay, suggests that infant and child mortality in pre-industrial societies was extraordinarily high by modern standards, frequently estimated between 30 and 50% of children not surviving to adulthood. This number is sobering, but it also reframes the question. Survival was not a guarantee. It was an outcome that depended enormously on the depth and consistency of the support network around each child. Children embedded in larger groups, with more alloparents, more redundancy of care, and more accumulated knowledge about danger, disease, and nutrition, had meaningfully better odds. Knowledge itself was a survival tool, transmitted with remarkable intention. Anthropologist Barry Hewlett, who has spent his career studying the Aka and other Central African foraging societies, documented something striking. Caregivers actively taught infants and toddlers, beginning astonishingly early. Mothers and other caregivers would guide an infant's hand toward a digging stick, demonstrate how to hold a small tool, or narrate ongoing tasks aloud even to children too young to respond. This was not idle babble. It was the beginning of an apprenticeship that would last the child's entire early life, a slow transfer of survival knowledge that began essentially the moment a child could sit upright. Now reconstruct a single day for a toddler in this world. The child wakes near a fire that never fully went out overnight, nestled against an older sibling for warmth. Breakfast is whatever was foraged or stored the day before, perhaps a piece of dried meat softened by chewing first by an adult. A practice anthropologists have documented across multiple foraging cultures as a way of pre-processing food for children without teeth strong enough to manage tough fibers alone. Throughout the morning, the toddler is rarely more than a few feet from at least one adult or older child. Play is not separate from learning. A toddler mimicking an adult stripping bark from a stick, even clumsily, is absorbing motor skills that will matter enormously in 10 years. By midday, if predators or rival groups are spotted nearby, the entire camp's behavior shifts instantly. Adults position themselves between children and the threat without needing to discuss it. This is not heroism, it is practiced, internalized behavior, the result of a community that has organized itself, generation after generation, around protecting its most vulnerable members. Here is the counterintuitive twist in this story. Modern parenting culture often emphasizes intensive one-on-one attention, a single parent, or two, devoting enormous individual focus to a child. But the anthropological record suggests this is historically unusual. For the overwhelming majority of human existence, children were raised in dense, overlapping networks of care, where no single adult bore total responsibility, and where children themselves, even very young ones, were active contributors to the community rather than passive dependents shielded from all responsibility. Anthropologist David Lancy, who has written extensively comparing childhood across cultures, has argued that the Western model of childhood, one defined by extended dependency, minimal labor, and constant adult supervision focused on a small number of children, is itself a relatively recent and culturally specific invention. For most of human history, children were integrated into the working and social life of the group far earlier and far more fully than is typical today. This does not mean ancient childhood was easy. The mortality statistics make that brutally clear. But it does mean that the structures supporting children were, in their own way, remarkably resilient, built not around isolated nuclear units, but around redundancy, distributed responsibility, and the accumulated wisdom of an entire group invested in every child's survival. You are descended from children who made it, who were carried, fed, taught, and protected by networks far larger than a single set of parents. The instinct you may feel to seek support from extended family, from friends who feel like family, from a wider community when raising a child, that instinct is not new. It is ancient. It is, quite possibly, the very thing that allowed your species to survive its own helplessness in the first place. You were once that infant, utterly dependent, unable to do anything for yourself. And somehow, across 300,000 years of fire, cold, predators, and uncertainty, a network of people who were not required to care for you, cared for you anyway. That is not a coincidence. That is the story of how your species survived itself. If you enjoyed this deep dive, please subscribe to help the channel grow. Rest assured, this content is entirely human-crafted, curated from books, peer-reviewed articles, and verified sources. Spot any missing details? Let's discuss it in the comments. Hello and see you in the next video.